Welcome to In the Black, where we celebrate stories of transformation, resilience, and rising into the life you were meant to live. I'm your host, Araceli, and this space was created to amplify voices often overlooked. Women who've come through the fire with wisdom, strength, and heart. Whether you're here for healing, clarity, or just good conversation, you belong here. Let's get into it. So today on In the Black podcast, I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Liz, a remarkable adoptee, writer, performer, and healing guide whose work has transformed the lives of countless adults navigating the complex journey of adoption. Dr. Liz didn't realize the full impact of maternal separation on her life until she hit a wall, realizing something needed to shift if she was ever going to move forward, have healthy relationships, and feel whole. What started as a simple invitation to write about her experience of being adopted became a profound healing journey that led to her PhD, the award winning autobiographical show, Unmothered. A story of adoption and patriarchy, and the creation of Migrating Toward Wholeness, a trauma informed framework that uses expressive writing and poetry to guide adoptees and others towards healing. Dr. Liz now uses her story and methodology to lead workshops, one on one coaching, and performances both nationally and internationally, helping others reclaim their narrative and find wholeness. Dr. Liz, welcome to the show. We're so excited to hear your story.
I'm so excited to be here and to be able to share my story. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So before we get into the amazing story of all the things you've done, just tell us a little bit of who Dr. Liz is today.
Well, today I'm a pretty happy person. I live a pretty, not super exciting, but interesting life. I live in Michigan and I have a cat and I love gardening and cooking and I love helping people heal.
I love that. Gardening. Do you grow your own herbs and vegetables?
A little bit. I've grown this year. I've only been in Michigan about 3 years, so my gardening journey is still a work in progress because 3 summers ago, some things did really well, and then last year, not so much, and then this year was kind of in the middle. And so I'm just figuring out how to grow things now that I live here. So I do have some vegetables, and I like experimenting with trying to grow different vegetables. The thing that did the best this year was eggplant um, and peppers. And I have a lot of pollinator gardens. I've planted 3 different sections of pollinator gardens around our house. And so one thing that I'm most proud of this year is what my partner calls my butterfly ranch. I planted these tiny little bronze fennel plants on the side of our house last year, and they were maybe 4 inches tall, if that. This year they're over 6 feet tall, and there were tons of swallowtail caterpillars that lived in those plants and then turned into butterflies. And so we've had all these butterflies flying around, and it's been really cool and a great metaphor for transformation. In fact, that's why the logo of Migrating Toward Wholeness is a butterfly made up of a whole bunch of other butterflies because of transformation and change.
Oh, I love that. Great segue into you. So, Michigan, wow. How is the weather? Has it turned cold yet?
It's getting cooler. We've had some cooler weather this past week or so. It kind of dipped down into the 70s and it's going to get a little bit cooler. Today's kind of warm. I think it's going to get up to about 80, but we're in that weird transition space. There's that word again. Um that keeps coming up for me, transition. And so we're going to bounce back and forth a little bit, I think, weather-wise, but that's just kind of the way Michigan weather is. You can in a week you can get 4 seasons sometimes. So, but
Yeah,
it's nice. We do get 4 seasons, and that's nice.
that's what we had in Missouri. So let's dive into. The early days. Dr. Liz, can you take us back to your early life as an adoptee and share how maternal separation shaped you even before you fully understood it?
That is a really important question. And I think, so I grew up in an Italian American family. I'm originally from New York, and actually probably you'll hear it the more I talk, but I have an older brother who's also adopted, and I don't remember not knowing. We always knew we were adopted. It was always a thing, from the time we were small that my parents talked about with us, but we didn't talk a lot about it because there wasn't a lot of information. And so I think, the first, at least from my earliest memories of knowing, I remember my brother and I talking about coming from someone else's stomach. And like that was our context for what it meant to be adopted. Like we knew that we came from somebody else, that we had other mothers. We both have different biological families. And that was kind of the extent of it. And then in 1982, my younger brother Frank was born. He's my parents' biological son, and he was born just after deinstitutionalization. And so the focus of our family really kind of shifted at that point because my parents, understandably didn't know what his needs were going to be, and they had to start to figure out what, what kind of programs he needed, what kind of support he needed, what schools he could go to, all the therapies and things like that, because at the time nobody really knew what to do with people with disabilities like Down syndrome. And so there was a lot of learning that my parents had to do. And also they didn't know. They weren't given any support when they adopted me and my brother around the fact that trauma is inherent in adoption, and that when you separate a baby from its mother, there is a deep psychic wound that changes the nervous system and then has impacts across a lifetime. They had no idea about any of that. And so they thought, the conventional wisdom at the time, you put kids, babies with in a loving home, everything's going to be fine. And so after my brother was born, we kind of just stopped talking about adoption. It became a thing, just like a thing we didn't talk about. And even if we did continue to talk about it, there wasn't a lot of information available to us because of closed adoption records. And so it became a thing that I thought about a lot, that I knew was a part of my identity, but I couldn't really ask questions. It was a little uncomfortable to ask questions because we had stopped talking about it. And then as I got older and into junior high and high school, I started to stay really busy. I was involved in everything. I did sports, I did theater, I was in all the plays, I was the president of the clubs. I kept my schedule so jam packed. And in retrospect, I realized that was my way of avoiding all of the uncomfortable feelings that I had that I didn't understand, which were tied to my unacknowledged grief, loss, and embodied trauma. I didn't figure all that stuff out until my late 30s. So my early life was just a lot of activity, which I now understand is a trauma response because I needed to keep myself moving and doing so that I could avoid the feelings that I didn't understand. And so I'd say that's a little bit of how I recognize now that the trauma of maternal separation shaped me without even realizing it for so much of my life, that it drove me to behave in certain ways in order to make myself, and I say this in my show on Mother, in order to make myself feel safe, right?
When was the first time that came to your attention that you were using, you were staying busy because of trauma response?
Yeah, again, I didn't really figure all of this out until my late 30s, and that's, kind of where we're coming into this conversation, or why we came into this conversation, was because I that's very much the genesis of everything, is that I hit a point where I felt stuck, and I was almost 38 and had gotten out of another really unhealthy relationship and felt like a hamster on a wheel, like I was constantly in motion, but I wasn't getting anywhere. And I was going to therapy at the time, and the therapy wasn't helping. And I left every appointment feeling worse than when I went in. And that's when I kind of started to take a step back and realize like something's going on here. Something is happening that I need to figure out because I've been in this with this therapist for the majority of 15 years off and on, and I feel terrible, and I feel worse, and I should be feeling better, like therapy is supposed to help, so what's that about? And I also realized that I had this pattern of really unhealthy relationship, choosing these men that were just either emotionally unavailable at best and abusive at worst. And I said, "Okay, there's something in this pattern, and if I don't figure out why I keep doing this, I'm never going to have the kind of relationships that I want. I'm never going to move forward in my life, and I'm just gonna stay miserable and stuck." And so, it was at that point that I did the thing that it comes naturally to me, which is to turn to education as a way to respond to figuring something out or taking action. And so at the time, I had 2 credits left to a master's degree that had been unfinished for a little over 10 years at that point because of uh, an abusive marriage that I had at that point had gotten out of. But I was unable to finish that degree because of my ex-husband who didn't let me go back to school, and then a whole string of other life events. And I finally had the opportunity to go back to school. And when I re-enrolled in the program, the coordinator suggested that I take another class, even though I didn't need to take another class. And she suggested that I take this class in autobiographical writing. And that is the thing that really cracked all of this open because in that class, it was the same time that I was like trying to figure out why I was so stuck. I was trying to figure out why I keep making all these really terrible, unhealthy choices in relationships, why therapy wasn't helping me. And in that class, I was invited to write about being adopted for the first time. And so then I started to do some research into the little bit of information that I did have. And there, I have a file full of what's called non-identifying information, which is exactly what it sounds like. It is. It's a copy of any original paperwork from the social work file, and all personal information is redacted. And I thought, okay, well, maybe I go back to this file and I start to learn something. Maybe there's something I missed when I first got this, 18 years ago or whatever it was. And so I went back to that file, and there was a little piece of paper in that file that had a suggested list of reading, which at the time I had originally gotten the file when I was about 20 years old. I didn't think anything of it because, like, there were titles like The Primal Wound and Journey of the Adopted Self. And I was like, oh, I'm not wounded. I'm fine. Like, I don't know what and so I thought, oh, maybe need to start reading these books. And so I started reading The Primal Wound, and I was like, "Oh, okay, I am not crazy." The pieces started clicking into place because I finally understood that the deep sense of disconnection and confusion and like sadness that I had my whole life was connected to having been separated from my mother at birth, having no information about who she was or where I came from or anything, and being expected to just move on with my life as if nothing had happened. And then I started to figure out how to tell my own story. And so those are the things that really helped me to start to figure out that earlier on in my life, all the things I was doing were actually coping mechanisms because of they came out of my trauma responses.
That is so fascinating how everything happens for a reason. And you going back and going and taking that course. That's so, So interesting. I love
Yeah.
that. Let's pull up the other questions. You said that you hit a wall before your healing journey really began. What did that moment feel like, and how did you realize that something needed to change?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I started talking about just a couple minutes ago, I just felt like nothing felt good. I felt like I was living someone else's life. I felt like physically a sense of like deep discomfort, but also like psychically and emotionally. And I have always been a very emotional person. My body's response to a lot of things is tears, whether it's anger or sadness or frustration or happiness. Like that's what my body does. But I was at a point where I I just kind of I felt like I was going through the motions without actually like really being present in my life. And I don't think I could have explained it in those words at the time, but that's very much what happened. And I knew that I needed to shift something. And I knew that I needed to make myself feel better. And I think that the big thing was the therapy coming out. I remember very specifically standing on the sidewalk outside of my therapist's office in Manhattan one afternoon after an appointment, and like just in tears and like feeling like, what is the point? Like, why am I even like trying to help myself in this way if I feel so shitty? Because it just felt so shitty all the time to have all of these overwhelming emotions but not know where they were coming from, and also to have felt like I failed in having a good relationship with another person. Like the thing I wanted most was to have an actual partnership with somebody and like be in love and and also be cared for and care for someone else in an equal way, not with an unequal way where one person does more than the other person, or there's abuse happening, which was definitely my pattern. And so I was like, why, why do I keep doing this to myself? And yeah, I mean, I just didn't feel good about anything. And so it was at that point that I knew that I said that I tell people all the time, I had this come to Jesus with myself where I was like, I need to figure this out. And it started, and so like it came from just that like overwhelming physical and emotional feeling of like I don't feel good and something has to change.
That's crazy. Like when your body, your mentality, spiritual state, and physical state have just had enough. It's like the real sense of like hitting the wall.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's I think why I've described it in that way. It's like I hit a wall, and simultaneously I felt stuck, right? Like it was like I
Mhm.
ran into that wall, but also I was stuck. Like I wasn't there was nowhere to go except to figure out how to get through.
Yeah. 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 I love that. So before you started healing, how did you recognize the ways this separation impacted your relationship, your self-worth, or your sense of wholeness?
Yeah. So for me, I mean, it's so much of recognizing that I needed to heal and I needed something different in my life came out of the recognition that all of my relationship choices had been made because I didn't feel worthy. I didn't feel like I was worthy of love or care or um an equal partnership. And that, of course, was a very subconscious message. That was not a conscious thing that I understood. In retrospect, I now know that I had this deeply ingrained sense of, well, if my mother gave me away, then I must not be good enough. And so that replicated that implicit message, which is not true, replicated itself in the relationships that I chose, or the people that I accepted into my life, because I did not have a good sense of myself. And this is separate from the fact that I was raised in a very loving, supportive family, right? And that's the other thing that's really important in these conversations about the experience of being adopted and the way that trauma manifests, is that there's a both and I can both have had a really beautiful family upbringing and a lot of love and a lot of support, and I can also have carried the imprint of trauma and have made all of these disastrous relationship choices because of my own intrinsic feelings of not being good enough, feeling unworthy, and feeling less than.
So, have you found your parents?
Yeah, so I have been in reunion with my first mom since early 2017, and that was about the begin, a year or so into like like when I was really started my healing journey. One part of that was being able to access a copy of my original birth certificate, which I hadn't been able to in that up until that point. And interestingly, the universe does amazing things. And I got the copy of my birth certificate on my 40th birthday. And finally, after 4 decades, I had a name. I knew who she was. And suddenly she wasn't just a fuzzy, sort of ghost like image that I carried with me. She was a real person. She had a name. I could look her up on the internet, which is what we did, and I found her. And then it took me about a week or so to figure out what I was going to say, and then send her the message. And it's, a couple days after I reached out to her, she wrote back to me and said, I've been waiting for this day for 40 years. Um I hoped, that you would try to find me. And we started talking, and in fact, I just saw her yesterday. um and we, we don't live in the same state anymore, but I happened to be visiting for a friend's wedding, and so I just saw her yesterday, and it's been a slowly progressing relationship. If you can imagine what it's like to meet your mom, the one who gave birth to you, as a full adult at 40, and then try to fill in the 40 years that she didn't raise me, that someone else did, is kind of awkward and challenging. But I do know her, and I have met my half siblings and some of her family. I don't know who my biological dad is. That's information that I still don't have.
How come it took so long for you to be able to find who your mom was in the certificate?
That's a great question, and this is really like this is one of the problems for adult adoptees. It's one of the big problems in adoption, is that we don't have access to our original birth records. It's a state by state choice, and there are only a handful of states at this point that allow for full and unrestricted access to birth records. And then there are another handful of states like New Jersey, where I was born and adopted, that allow for restricted access, which means that if your biological parents have not redacted their information, then you can access a copy of your original birth certificate, and in some cases, copies of whatever original paperwork might happen to be in the social work file, if it still exists. And so the laws in New Jersey did not change until 2017, which is why it took me until I was 40 years old to get that information, because up to that point, the only thing I was allowed to have was, as I said earlier, my non identifying information, which I had sent away for probably in about 1998, when I was in college, and actually having a really hard time, like with my mental health and with relationships and thought. And one of my friends was like, "Oh, have you ever tried to figure out anything about your biological family or where you came from? And I was like, no, like the records are sealed. I don't really know how I would get anything. But then I learned that I could have my non-identifying information, but of course that doesn't tell you very much. And then I learned when I met my first mom, Mary, almost 2.5 decades later, that some of like half of the information in that paperwork was actually not true because the person who went to the adoption agency with her was her boyfriend who was not my biological dad, and it's his information that's on the paperwork. And that's true like of a lot of adoptees stories. When we get our paperwork, we find out that there's a lot of missing or incorrect information or like flat out lies. And it's worse for adoptees who have been adopted internationally, transnational adoptees who come from other countries. There's a lot of lying on paperwork. And in some cases it's really an issue of like human trafficking. And so there's like lots of advocacy and activism, activist groups in adoptee spaces that are doing that work. But I always like to talk about that in connection to my own experience because as a domestic adoptee, I have access to certain things, but there's still lies in that paperwork. But that issue is compounded for those of us adoptees who come from um, international adoptions, things that have been done by through less legal channels. And so the paperwork continues to be an issue because individual states get to decide whether they're going to allow access. And it's really a human rights issue because without access to our paperwork and our biological histories, the what I call collateral damage of that, the collateral damage of adoption is a thing I talk about a lot, is that we end up continuing to go through life and get into adulthood still feeling lost, still feeling disconnected, still and having significantly higher rates of mental health issues because of all of this unresolved trauma that is connected to not knowing our origins. And so it took me a long time to get access, and I only did by accident because the state happened to change the laws somewhat.
Wow. Have you, okay, two questions now. Well, now I'm thinking if there are any people out there, which I'm sure there are, who are trying to form an organizations around this to help change the law so that people can access their records and help them find that void. And then two, did you end up getting clarity from your birth mom and answering all the questions that you knew you had or maybe didn't know you had, but were you able to kind of bring it all full circle, the reasons why she had to give you up and things like that, like bring closure, I guess.
Yeah. So the answer to the first question is yes, there are organizations that are doing the work of helping adoptees get access to records and working to change legislation. One of the main ones is my friend Greg Luce. He's in Minnesota, and his organization is called Adoptees United. They're doing fantastic work. And if anybody listening wants to donate to that cause, I highly recommend that you do because he provides free legal services to adoptees, particularly those adoptees right now who are facing deportation, which is a whole other issue. And also working on with different advocacy groups from state to state to get some of the laws changed. But it's a slog, and it's grueling work. And and in fact, in the state of Michigan, there's also a group called Adoptee Advocates of Michigan that have been doing a lot of work to change the laws in Michigan. And there are lots of grassroots groups as well, but those are the two ones that I can think of off the top of my head that are and Adoptees United is a national organization that's sort of the umbrella and like helping all of the local grassroots groups to do the work. And then the second question, Yes, I think in some ways I have started to close some of the loop and get some answers. Very quickly after making contact with Mary, my first mom, she said to me, I've been waiting to hear from you. I've always wanted to know you, and I will tell you anything that you want to know. Um, and she told me that, in fact, in the letter that she wrote back to me, one of the things she said was, "Giving you up was one of the hardest things I ever had to do." And and then when we started talking, she said, I wanted to keep you." And she, to this day, still apologizes for, and I put, these are her words, for not being stronger, for not being able to keep me. Um, because she didn't have any support, because her family wouldn't support her, and um her her younger sister had gotten pregnant a year or so before and had been forced to have an abortion. And having witnessed that, she knew that she, didn't believe in abortion and didn't want to that, and I put this in quotes, choice, because that can be a choice, and it's an important choice for us to be able to make. But her sister didn't, it wasn't her sister's choice either, right? So there, like, a choice in the absence of choice is not a choice. And the same thing was true for her with having to surrender me to adoption, because she did not have the financial support or the emotional support from her family. And she was dating somebody who, and this is what I learned when we started talking, refused to raise another man's child, right? And so, tied up in that is like all of these really deeply problematic cultural narratives. That and I think the guilt that she feels largely comes from feeling like she wasn't strong enough to stand up to him to say, well, I want it, this is my baby, and I want to raise this baby, and needing to have some kind of support, and finding it at the time in him. And so so that's a little piece of that story. And just learning that she was forced to make a decision that wasn't really the decision she wanted to make, right? And so then knowing that, and I think I, in some way, always knew, because I knew, as terrifying as it was to reach out to her, I also knew that, just somehow deep in my bones, I knew that if I ever found her, that she would want to know me. And that was true.
It's almost like you felt the love and the like that deeper connection.
Mhm.
It's crazy. So your journey, writing about your adoption experience, can you walk us through the first attempt? What was it like, and how did it feel to start piecing together your own narrative?
It was hard. I Because, as I said a little while ago, I had been invited to take this class in autobiographical writing, which I thought sounded cool, and I didn't need the extra credits to complete my degree, but it was a way for me to feel like I was part of the department again and make some connections. And it was, I think, the biggest blessing in disguise, because in that class, I, you know, I started to figure out that I did have a story. But it was a struggle, because the first, I'm gonna say, probably 3 drafts were me regurgitating the story that I had been told my whole life by my parents about why I was adopted. And it was really their story. And my professor kept saying to me, "I see what you're trying to do, but this is not your story. It has to be your story." And I was like, "Okay, but okay, but I don't know anything. What am I going to do?" Right? And so I was kind of grasping at a lot of straws, because the first thing I did was I called my mom and I was like, "Hey, mom, you want to come over? I have to write this story for my class." And I think it has to be about myself, and I want to write about being adopted, and maybe there's, and I think at the time, I know at the time I had this thought of like, oh, maybe she's going to tell me something that I haven't heard before. I'm going to have some different experience of talking to her about this that's going to make me think about this in a different way. And then when I interviewed my mom, it was very much this sort of nostalgic remembering of, oh, well, your father and I always wanted to adopt, and we always knew that if we couldn't have children. And it was this sort of like very, her, and like understandably, like her version of the story that to me felt, was like, okay, but what am I going to pull out of that? So like that was my starting point, and it wasn't a really helpful one because it wasn't my story. But I didn't know, I had to figure out how to get into my story. And so then sort of the next version was like, oh, well, maybe let me look back at my non-identifying information, because I had this, photocopied file full of stuff stuck in an envelope in a drawer. And I said, well, maybe I can start to piece together some of my story there. So I went back to that folder. And then that's the point at which I started to realize that there was a story underneath the story. And I started to do some of the reading of the suggested books about the psychology of adoption and about the experience of being adopted and about the trauma of maternal separation. And then I started to make some connections. And then the really important thing that happened was I went back to some of my poetry that I had been writing since I was 14. And there was a poem that I call, that wasn't titled, but that I call Unanswered Questions because that's what it was about. And that was my way into my story, was through my own poetry that I had written, from my teenage years and in my 20s. And that has then very much become the tool that I have used in recreating my own narratives, is using poetry as the what I call the emotional glue, or the narrative thread, because those early poems were all about the unresolved grief, unacknowledged loss, and huge amount of embodied trauma that I had that nobody recognized, right? And so that was my way into telling that story, but it was a struggle. It took me many, many tries to get it right, but I did.
That is so fascinating because I also discovered that recently. I pulled out my book of what I used to write, and you're so right. That reveals so much of what you were going through, but you didn't know it. It's just like, emotionally and everything. You just are so creative and you just throw it all on paper, and it's fascinating to see. So, really cool. So finding your story wasn't easy, obviously, as you have shared, especially with closed records and secrecy. After discovering the truth of your adoption and reuniting with your mom, with your birth mom, and kind of getting a few insights and or closure around your whole life, going through your whole life of not knowing, what did it feel like to reclaim your narrative and to kind of get a little bit of closure?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the sort of organic flow of the way this all unfolded for me, was that after writing that first story, then I about a year later is when I started to think about doing my PhD. And then around that same time was when I was gaining access to some of my records and got my original birth certificate. And so there was like all of these things kind of happening parallel to one another that led me into the next part of really reclaiming my narrative. And that came when I got into grad school for my PhD, because I had, struggled through this first act of telling my story. And then I figured out who my first mom was. And then I was figuring out what I was going to write about for my dissertation. And I realized that I was really interested in using writing as a tool for healing. And also, I have a background as a performer, and I had spent many years while I was doing all my writing, secret poems. I was also doing a lot of community theater and using theater as a tool for managing and helping myself navigate those overwhelming emotions. And so when I was conceptualizing what my dissertation was going to be, I was like, I think I want to write a one woman show. And that was really the huge act of reclaiming my narrative, because I went from thinking about wanting to write a memoir as part of my dissertation into like, no, I'm actually going to like write and perform this thing and like tell this story out loud. And so it was the act of like taking what I had started with that first narrative, which is unanswered questions, and then starting to formulate a longer picture, because now I had more information. I had been in reunion with my first mom for a little bit of time, and I had also been having some really difficult and sometimes painful conversations with my parents about all of this stuff, because they were trying to understand, like, what do you mean you have trauma, and what do you mean, like, but we gave you such a good life. And I'm like, yes, that's separate from the fact that this trauma exists. And I was trying to like have these conversations and explain all of this. And so then my answer to that was like to use writing and performance to really tell this deeply personal story that could have impact, not only for me in my own healing journey as a tool for literally rewriting my narrative, but also giving voice to it out loud, because Unmothered, which is what my dissertation became, was my solo show Unmothered, was really, so for the first time, was me. I said a lot of things out loud for the first time. And so being able to put my story into performance, like for with and for other people, so that I could be witnessed in these particular truths, and then also have people like come back and say, "Oh, I never thought about adoption in that way." And then have other adoptees say to me, "Oh my God, you have just said all of the things I have felt my whole life but could never put words to," has been, I think for me, that's the full circle moment, was like being able to articulate this lifetime of of internal experiences that was laid out in the decades of poetry that I had, as I said, but then also being able to fill in the gaps by writing new parts of my story, writing new poems about the like I wrote a series of poems about the night I was born, because I didn't know what that was like. And I still don't 100% know what that's like, because my first mom's memories are imperfect, and she doesn't remember all of it, because that's what trauma does, right? And so yeah, so being able to write and perform Unmothered, which I still, continue to perform, has sort of been the full circle moment of what it looks like to have a complete version of a story. And it's one that's my version of the story. And in my process, my Migrating Toward Wholeness process, that's where all of that came from, because Unmothered was the first iteration of me making space to heal, me rewriting the truth, me expressing the core or primal wound that I now knew that I had, um, becoming the subject of my own story and breaking a lot of silence. And so it was those five foundational pieces were all in that process. I hadn't named them yet, but that's exactly what that was about. And that's the that's the important thing, right? Is that we take the story and we turn it into like, and that's how I've sort of taken all of this pain and turned it into purpose, is recognizing that in my own life I did have a story to tell, and that it mattered, not just to me but to other people.
That's why we have this podcast. It's this platform for many people to share their story and to help others. So I want to go back to when you said you're still performing. So it does say on here, writer and performer of Unmothered. Okay, winner of best. So how are you, what does that look like? You're currently performing. So are you booking venues and performing? And then you also have Migrating Toward Wholeness. So
Mhm.
that's where you work on one-on-one with people.
Mhm. Yeah. So Unmothered, yeah, as you said, I won Best Autobiographical Show at the United Solo Festival in 2022. And then since then have gone on to either be requested for bookings. So sometimes folks reach out to me at adoption related organizations for I performed it actually at an adoption conference about a year ago or a year and a half ago, and um, I have performed it locally at certain venues. Sometimes people reach out to me and they want to bring it to their, to their school or their organization. And I have a collaboration with other adoptees, friends of mine, Louise and Sarah, who are the co-hosts of the podcast Adoption: The Making of Me. We have a beautiful collaboration where a couple of times a year they do a live broadcast of their podcast, and then they invite other adoptees who are storytellers and authors and things to come and be in community for the weekend. And they do the live version of their podcast. There's a panel of other adoptee authors who talk about their work and their stories, and then I perform Unmothered at those live events. And we've got one coming up on September 12th in DC. That's the next time we're all doing that together, and there's a whole bunch of invited guests, and so that's sort of like a quarterly thing. We usually do them, 3 or 4 times a year. And then, my work with Migrating Toward Wholeness is my day-to-day work, where I work one-on-one with folks. Some folks that I'm working with right now, I'm actually work supporting them through telling their own stories. A couple of them are writing books, and we're using the Migrating Toward Wholeness process to help them get at their stories, to help facilitate some healing in the process so that they can figure out what the story is they need to tell in the book that they want to put out into the world. I also do small group coaching as well. And so I have small group programs, and the next one of those will start in October. And I do a lot of single workshops. I facilitate workshops for organizations, and I have a teen program that I'm also working on. I've got some partnerships in progress with other organizations that are coming up in 2026.
That is awesome. So when you say you perform, is that like a speaker? Like it's not like you're not performing a play.
Oh, no, it's a play.
Okay, it's
It's
a
a
play?
I should have clarified, I apologize. Yeah, so Unmothered is a solo performance piece. It is it is me on stage for 75 minutes telling my story through poetry and narrative and movement about what it feels like to be adopted. And so the sort of the whole story that we've talked our way through in this conversation, that's what Unmothered is. It tells the story of my life and all of the ways that being adopted affected me, that I didn't start to piece together until I hit that wall and started writing about it, and then started to figure out what the story was. And so it's a play um that is is a really intimate experience, which is why I can take it into, various spaces. I have performed it in actual theaters, which is always wonderful. I have also performed it in conference rooms because it's a piece of embodied storytelling, and so it doesn't require a theater space if there's not one available, but it's better if there is one because it is a theatrical performance.
Wow. So during your dissertation, did you perform that 75 minutes in front of your colleagues?
Yes. So the original production was actually longer. It was a little over an hour and a half long. And interestingly, I performed it 3 times. I was living in Utah at the time. I performed it 3 times. The third two one was at on the campus of the school that I was the university that I was teaching at the time. as part of a Writing for Social Change conference. And then the other two performances were at a local theater that I had rented for the purpose of performing and doing talkbacks. And each performance is followed by a talkback because a big part of the experience is about using this piece of theater to open up an empathetic conversation because that's how change happens. And the theater as a tool for social change, the idea is that the audience is in relationship with me, the performer. They're witnessing my story in a really personal, intimate, and visceral way, and then they're able to process through some of that by asking questions and talking about what may have come up for them by watching the performance. Um, and a lot of what came up in the original talkbacks, people were like, I never thought about adoption in that way. I had never thought about first mothers in that way, you know, because there's a dominant narrative that the media and culture want us to believe, which is that adoption is a beautiful thing and it's a win-win for everybody and we're solving one problem, but we're actually like not solving a problem because we're hiding the truth of it, which is that regardless of the situation there's always trauma. And when we can't, when we don't make room for the conversation about trauma, nobody heals. And that's so much of why I decided to do it. So yes, I performed it for my colleagues, I performed it for different audience members. Anybody could have come, and we had, lots of people. My parents came. That was they've seen the show I think twice now. um both versions, the original version and then the award-winning version that I did in New York at the United Solo Festival. And yeah.
That's all probably thanks to your background in acting, right?
Yeah. I got lucky because I went to this really amazing, PhD program that allowed me to take my background as a performer and a writer and do something really interesting with it. It was a program that was very much focused on creativity and social justice, and so when I went to my committee and I said, "I think I wanna write a one-woman show for as part of my dissertation," they were like, "Do it." Um, and I'm so grateful because for that support and enthusiasm because it has become a cultural artifact, right? And it has become a real vehicle for change. And 5 years later, I'm still using it to open up conversations, to make other adoptees feel seen and heard and understood, to create spaces for healing. And I could, when I originally wrote it and performed it, I couldn't have told you that that was what was gonna happen. I was like, "Well, this feels like the thing I need to do." And, because my undergraduate degree is in theater and I was worked as a performer for many years and I'm a member of both professional actors unions, it just kind of made sense to me that I should use the the tools that I had, that were important to me to do something different.
That is super fascinating. Okay, for listeners who might be carrying unprocessed trauma or struggling to feel whole, what are one or two practical steps they can take today to start reclaiming their story?
That's a great question. And I would say and this is good for anybody because I think all of us carry some form of unprocessed trauma. It's just learning to recognize it. One tool that I like to teach people to do is kind of like the four N's. So it's name, notice, nurture, and next step. So first we want to, or it's notice, name, nurture, next step. So first we want to notice what's happening, right? Where do I feel that in my body? Then we want to name it. We want to put language to it. Um, this feels like tightness in my chest, or this feels like a flight or fight response if you have that language. We want to nurture it. So we want to do something nurturing for ourselves. Sometimes that's just a gentle, a deep breath, just regrounding by taking a breath. I like to use touch points. I put my hand on my heart and one hand on my belly and take a deep breath, and that reminds me to ground myself in my body. Um, so that's nurturing for me. And then what's one tiny next step I can take? And that's then figuring out what the next step is to move out of that.
I like that. Something practical they can use, our listeners can use. On this podcast, we love to ask when you hear the phrase in the black, meaning in abundance, growth, and positive transformation, what does that mean to you personally?
I think for me, that means looking at everything as a possibility for growth, being able to recognize that even in the difficult moments, even like late, I've been in a big season of transition, for example, and transitions feel really hard for adopted people, for people who have experiences of trauma like mine, because it activates all this old stuff. But recognizing that transition and change is an opportunity to grow and to expand, and that it's really about possibilities instead of um and always looking forward instead of looking backward.
That is good. I'm also working and transitioning.
Yeah.
Um, so then, where can our listeners find you, connect with your work, and access your workshops, coaching, and performances?
Everything is on my website, lizdebetta.com, and you can also find me on social media. On Instagram, it's at dr.liz.debetta, but I'm Dr. Liz Debetta on all the socials, so really easy to find. But my website is the best place to find all of the information.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for coming on our podcast. Is there anything else that you would like to add?
I just want folks to know that healing is possible and that you're worth investing in, and that not all healing spaces are equal. So you should follow me on social media to learn a little bit more about that, because that's the focus of where I'm going this month, is talking about that all healing spaces are not created equally, and that it's we're worth investing in. That healing is a worthy investment, because staying stuck is not a good place to be.
Beautiful. Well said. Thank you for being here. If something you heard today moved you, share it with someone you love. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can follow me on Instagram at In the Black Passion Project for more behind the scenes and guest spotlights. And remember, no matter where you've been, you're not behind. You're becoming. Stay in the black.